Jesus was born in circumstances of war and murder. This is a dark place that he enters. Guns are pointed, knives are drawn, blood flows. It's not little Jesus, meek and mild. This is a story about refugees and about genocide and about crossing national borders and about obeying oppressive edicts from nasty occupying authorities. And unless we see that as the backdrop, we fail to appreciate something really important about the nature of the Christmas story.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable.
Well, Charles Foster, we're going to be talking about this wonderful book, The Christmas Mystery. But before we sort of dive into the Christmas story, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself? Who are you? What do you do?
I'm Charles Foster. The most important thing about me is that I am a husband and father of 6 wonderful and anarchic children. I am a fellow of Exeter College at the University of Oxford. I'm also a practicing barrister. And I spend most of my time these days, apart from trying to control the anarchic children, writing books. And I write books about all sorts of things, including theology, philosophy, natural history, and my academic province, which is the law. Within the law, I'm particularly interested in medical law. So the seams within medical law that I've been mining recently have been things to do with identity and personhood and human dignity.
That's quite a range of things. You're also a qualified vet, aren't you?
I am, and I'm still on the register, and still sometimes I go along and do a bit of rather amateurish veterinary work at local community farms, or try and trot a pony up and guess which leg it's lame on. But I'm very out of touch with the veterinary world now.
Okay, so I mean, with kind of all of that under your belt, what was your purpose in doing the research for this book about Christmas? You know, what made you want to look into the Christmas story?
The Christmas story is the grand miracle, as C.S. Lewis put it. So this is God welling up into our world in a way which had not previously happened. It's something which transforms the whole way in which we relate to matter, to material things. And if this Christmas story isn't true, then the rest of the Christian story just evaporates. You can't have Easter without Christmas. And I wanted to know how I should relate in the right and most vibrant way to the material world, which I love. I'm a deeply unspiritual person. I like things. I like matter. I like wine. I like food. And I wanted to be reassured that it was legitimate to enjoy those things, to live as fully as we are told to do within this material world. And the source of the legitimacy of loving being in this life is God's, Jesus's inhabitation of the material world in the incarnation. So that was what was behind this inquiry.
And you say at the beginning of the book that you dodged the accounts for years. Why was that? And was there a particular thing that you thought, right, now is the time that I need to look into this? Was there something that kind of kick-started the whole process?
I dodged them for 2 reasons. One was I thought I knew these stories. Mm-hmm. So I had been to nativity plays as a child actor and as a tolerant parent for decades. And I thought I knew what the Christmas story said. Which was wrong. And the second reason was that when I went to the Bible, I looked at the opening of the nativity accounts in Matthew and in Luke, and they're really boring. They are genealogies, deeply off-putting. And I was just too tired to sit down and try and get my head around what this was really all about. I had suspicions growing suspicions over the years that the Nativity story wasn't the full story.
So what changed? What made you think, right, now is the time?
It was the knowledge that I'd always nudged these stories to the edge of my attention. And then I wondered what I had been missing. And so that there came a time when these itches that I had couldn't be ignored anymore. And so I dived into it. And typically my way of diving into something is to try and write a book about it. So all my books, and this is true for most authors, I think, are really written for me in an attempt to work out the answer to a problem. And this book, The Christmas Mystery, is a classic example of that.
And how did you go about? I mean, who did you speak to? Where did you even start the process?
I started with reading the Nativity accounts in Matthew and in Luke. Those are the only two Nativity accounts, of course. And then I went from there to the other two canonical Gospels, noting increasingly worriedly that there was no mention of this birth story in those accounts. And then I went to the commentaries, and then I went to the history books, and then I went to lots of really patient experts. Over the years, I've spent a long time for various academic reasons in the Holy Land, and so I spent a long time trudging around the sites which are associated with the Nativity story, talking to archaeologists and historians, gradually trying to fit together these extremely complex pieces from these alarmingly complicated stories.
Well, we'll get to some of the things that you found in your research, but you kind of touched on this already, but why do the birth narratives matter? How important is the Christmas story, do you think?
If the incarnation didn't happen, we can forget the whole of the Christmas story, the Christian story. If we know something about what this story really meant, we would be able to conclude more about what God's purposes were in the Jesus mission, rather than just fast forwarding, as so many Protestants, particularly so many evangelicals do, straight to Easter and thinking we can just understand the rescue mission without understanding the way in which God in the incarnation chooses to stand alongside us, to be inside us, to be inside the whole material world. So that was what I thought was the most important thing about trying to puzzle all this out.
So pretty big deal, really.
It's a big deal.
And you open your book, I love this, with the line, the church by and large does not celebrate Christmas. I mean, that is quite a statement to say that the church doesn't celebrate Christmas. What did you mean by that?
I mean by that we regard Christmas as the nativity play pastiche, with the oxen and the asses, which are nowhere to be found in the Gospels. We sanitize the wise men. They were shamans. They were the people who would not be comfortable in most modern evangelical churches. We make it all too cozy. Jesus was born in circumstances of war and murder. This is a dark place that he enters. Guns are pointed, knives are drawn, blood flows. It's not little Jesus, meek and mild. This is a story about refugees and about genocide, and about crossing national borders, and about obeying oppressive edicts from nasty occupying authorities. And unless we see that as the backdrop, we fail to appreciate something really important about the nature of the Christmas story, and about the fact that when something ultimately good erupts into the world, it is immediately confronted by something which is ultimately dark. So the story tells us something profound about the forces which work in the cosmos, about the way in which good chooses to work. It tells us about a new modus operandi of God. So previously, the direction of God's action had been perceived as being from outside in. The direction of that action changes in the incarnation. The healing which is started then occurs from the inside out. And if we appreciate that, we feel differently about ourselves. We feel differently about the whole of the material world. We should feel differently about the people who are all around us. The Christmas story takes me directly to that wonderful sermon by C.S. Lewis, The Weight of Glory, in which he talks about there being no mere mortals, about everybody around us, the people who we are bored with, who we despise, being creatures of infinite worth. It's immortals that we joke with, he says, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. And so the incarnation is an invitation to take humans a great deal more seriously than we did before. And as Lewis again points out in that sermon, it's only if we take the world, and particularly humans, as seriously as they should be taken, because God was occupying a human body of the same sort as the humans that we marry, snub, and exploit. We have more, unless we take them as seriously as we should, we can't have as much fun as we should. So he goes on, it's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. And the incarnation shows us, I think, that we are all of infinite potential. We are all infinitely loved. The incarnation would have happened if there had only been one person who was needing salvation, needing rescue. So but it tells me some really important things about the way in which I should orientate myself to the whole world, and particularly to the humans in my world. But it also tells me something really important, which I usually forget, about free will. Protestants, I think, have lost such a lot by being scared of the figure of Mary, feeling that to respect Mary is to sideline Jesus, rather than by acknowledging that the whole Jesus project turned on her saying yes when she need not have said yes. She could have said no. This was not an act of rape. And if she had said no, redemption wouldn't have happened. So that illustration of the vulnerability of the whole God project, the whole redemption project, is something which is both exhilarating and vertiginous to think about. And also, as I reflected on the figure of Mary, I was taken back all the time to the way in which Mary is prefigured in the Old Testament. I don't like the expression the Old Testament; it's very offensive to Jewish people. The Hebrew Bible. We have Jesus as the first Adam. Paul's always talking about it. But if you have a first Adam, you also got to have a new Eve, and that's Mary.
Mm.
So this inquiry and the reflection which it forced on me caused me to shed some of my traditional suspicions of the figure of Mary and the way that she has been viewed, and to be thankful to her for saying yes and making the whole project of God welling up into this material world possible. That was a new perspective for me.
Well, we'll hear a bit more about Mary and some of the other key characters in the Christmas stories in a bit. But I'd love to just talk to you about, you sort of mentioned that you go to Jerusalem quite a lot. And there's an encounter in your book where you're talking to a Christian archaeologist in Jerusalem. And you asked him lots of interesting questions and had some interesting conversations. And one of the questions you asked him, I really loved. You said, suppose someone produced incontrovertible evidence that showed that the resurrection accounts were actually fairy tales. How would it affect you? I'd like to ask you that question in a minute, but before, what was his response to your question, and what was your reaction to his answer?
Well, it was a dodging by him of the question. So he simply insisted that the Christian mythos was necessarily in the realm of story. You see exactly the same things from both dogmatic fundamental secularists and dogmatic fundamentalist believers. You see people locked into their own paradigms and unable to break out of it. So it would seem to me that unless a Christian is able to consider the possibility that Christianity is a fairy story, that their faith is a pretty mean thing. You know, if there's nothing that could be done to displace it, that would seem to me to devalue the currency of faith. Paul, when he talks about the resurrection, doesn't have that attitude at all. You know, he's quite clear. If Jesus isn't risen from the dead, then our faith is vain. But you see exactly the same thing amongst secular fundamentalists too. I've encountered it again and again in the research for the various books I've written. You have people who are unable to consider the possibility that the Christian claims might be true, and there is nothing that can be done to convince anyone otherwise. So also, we need humility on all sides and in all domains. And if we are faithful Christians, we need to acknowledge the vulnerability of our faith. We need to acknowledge that if the bones of Jesus are dug up tomorrow in Palestine, we will have been barking up the wrong tree for the last 2,000 years. And I think that living with the possibility of being confounded, living with the uncertainties, makes our relationship with God a more real thing, because those are the sorts of uncertainties which we live with when we're in real relationships with humans as well. You know, we can't be sure that the people who we regard as most trustworthy are never going to betray us. It's the faith exists in living with the possibility of that uncertainty. Yes, I am convinced that God is reliable and is not going to let me down, and that these historical pillars of the faith are robust. But I've got to acknowledge, even as I rejoice in that certainty, that it might be untrue, and I think that gives a piquancy and a reality to the faith that I have, that it wouldn't have if our faith could be proved as a matter of mathematical certainty.
So how would you respond then if you were shown sort of incontrovertible proof that either the resurrection narratives weren't true, or I guess given what we're talking about, the Christmas narratives, what would your response be to them just not being true or being fairy tales?
I'd eat and eat more and drink more and have a fine old time until I was buried and started to rot. That's what I would do.
Okay. Happy time then. The title of your book, The Christmas Mystery, sort of implies that there is a lot of mystery surrounding the Christmas stories. There's lots that we can't know. But I guess on the flip side, is there anything that we can know about the Christmas stories?
Jesus existed. Almost all people, all respectable historians agreed about that. If he existed and was a human being, then he had to be born. If he was born, he had to be born to someone and somewhere. And that's all that we can be certain about in the Christmas story. The only two accounts that we've got in the canonical Gospels come from Matthew and from Luke. But those stories are very, very different. The only common points between them are that Mary and Joseph are betrothed, and that in Bethlehem, a son of unusual origin is born, and that he was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and that Mary was a virgin when she conceived him, and was a virgin when he was born.
And what are some of those key differences that we'll go into the differences in a later episode, the specific differences, but would you highlight what some of those big differences are between Matthew and Luke, or apparent differences?
Well, so in Matthew, Mary and Joseph seem to be residents of Bethlehem. In Luke, Nazareth seems to be the family home. And so in Matthew, because Mary and Joseph seem to be residents of Bethlehem, there's no pre-birth travel involved. And Matthew tells this story of the rule of Archelaus, Herod's son, over Judea, to explain why the couple leave Judea, where Bethlehem is, and go to Nazareth. It's in Matthew that Herod tries to recruit wise men as spies, and the plot fails, and we hear that horrible story about all the children in Bethlehem area 2 years or under dying. There's none of that in Luke. It's in Luke that we have an inn. In Matthew, the birthplace of Jesus is a house. It's in Luke that we have the angel choirs and the shepherds. In Luke, the general feel is much quieter than in Matthew. After Jesus is born in Bethlehem, he's brought to the Jerusalem temple in the prescribed way. Simeon and Anna predict great things for him, and then the family goes quietly home to Galilee. Not so, of course, in Matthew, because of this horrific killing of the children, of which the Holy Family had been warned in a dream. They go to Egypt, and they stay there until after the death of Herod. They plan to return to Judea, but because Archelaus is ruling there, they change their plan and divert up to Nazareth. So it's really hard to read those two accounts comfortably side by side. In the 2nd century, there was an Assyrian Christian attempt, which was called the Diatessaron, to harmonize the New Testament Gospels. The Diatessaron itself doesn't exist anymore. It's known only by commentaries. But it's very interesting that that attempt to harmonize was very strenuously suppressed.
Mm.
The Christians at that early time decided to live with the differences. It wasn't that they were stupid and couldn't see that there were differences between the Gospels, but they decided that there was a point in those differences being there. They believed in the inspiration of Scripture in a way that we really don't. Even in the evangelical world, it's interesting that the modern way of trying to express respect for Scripture is to try to say, yeah, well, it's all seamlessly the same story.
Mm.
That's not the way the early church did it. They opted for authenticity rather than ease. They thought that the Holy Spirit was making a point by deciding to encode these truths in this difficult way. And they worked on those difficulties. And in working at those difficulties, rather than brushing them under the carpet, they got some great riches.
Well, we're going to look specifically at some of those differences between the two gospel accounts, but you sort of touched on this already. But do you think it matters that they are so, at least on the surface of it, overwhelmingly different?
I think those differences, as I've just mentioned, are work points for us. And the fact that they have been implanted there means that we are supposed to work at what truths are implied by those differences. But the whole business of these apparently bound-or differences, I think, is supposed to hint to us that there's something really weird going on in the whole incarnation story. If God explodes into the world, you don't expect an easy story of the sort that could be set down in a few lines from a competent journalist. You expect there to be mysteries. You expect there to be tangles. You expect people to scratch their heads and wonder if they've seen things right. In looking at the other end of the story, at the resurrection accounts, there are, of course, very different accounts of the empty tomb and the post-resurrection experiences. This is a subject which I've written another book about, a book called The Jesus Inquest. And the overwhelming feeling when you read those accounts together is of honest people saying there's something extraordinary going on here. We can't quite make sense of it, using the usual presumptions that we bring to historical evidence. But this is how it seemed to us to be. I don't think it's quite like that in the story of the incarnation, but there's definitely a flavor of that, and I think that those difficulties are meant to make us interrogate our presumptions about how incarnation can happen and what it means, because these are stories not just about what incarnation looked like, but also about what incarnation meant. So these are, and this is so important to emphasize, these are stories of exposition, not merely reportage, not merely historical description. And we can see that very clearly, but particularly in the story that Matthew gives us.
Well, I suppose that raises the question of how should we be approaching the gospel narratives? Because you mentioned there it's not just reportage. We shouldn't just be reading it surface level.
We should approach them with fear and trembling, but we should also approach them having tried to delete from our minds our memories of nativity plays.
Mm-hmm.
We should approach them as we approach every Christian text and every human being and every human experience, expecting to be surprised, not expecting to have our presumptions confirmed, which is how most of us approach most of our human experiences.
Yeah.
Most people go to church, don't they? I know I do. Wanting to be reassured that we got it right. That's exactly the wrong way to go to church, isn't it? We should go to church expecting to come out a different person, with our ideas reformed. Lewis again talks about God as the great iconoclast who is continually smashing up our mere ideas about him. And he talks about all reality being iconoclastic. And I think that's right. And the disconcerting feel with which we leave our reading of the Christmas stories is, I think, a paradigm example of exactly that. We go into them thinking we understand what this is about.
Yeah.
We come out of them saying, goodness, I've no idea what that is about, but I know that it's wonderful, and I know that it's the start of a flowering of divinity from underneath the earth, from within the earth, and from within me, which is supposed to transform me in a way which is different from the sort of transformation that comes from the beaming into us of theological propositions or epiphanies which appear outside us.
Well, we're going to dive into Matthew and Luke in greater detail in the next episode. But just as we sort of come to the end of this episode, why do you think Mark and John don't mention the birth narratives if it is such an important part of the Christian story?
I think that they have different agendas. So John is a writer who does have a story about the start of Jesus. It's just that he locates that start before time itself begins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the pre-existing God, and the Word was God. And he presumably thinks that to mention the earthly eruption of Jesus into Palestine would dilute the dramatic force of that story. Mark is very keen to emphasize to us how dramatic it was when the adult Jesus burst onto the historical scene, and he moves quickly and artlessly from the beginning of Jesus's ministry to Jesus's death. So I don't think it's heretical, far from it, to say, as I expect many evangelicals would say, that the gospel writers had an agenda. They plainly do. Matthew's agenda is to show us that Jesus is prefigured in the Hebrew scriptures. He constantly cites those scriptures to make points about almost everything that he states about Jesus's life. Luke sets out, he tells us to write an orderly account of the events of Jesus's life. It's the nearest thing to a biography that we have. But he too has an agenda other than biography. He wants to show us that the life and death of Jesus are the result of a divine plan. And the birth story that he tells fits well with that agenda. So different agendas. That's why I think Mark and John don't specifically mention the earthly birth of Jesus. There are plenty of opportunities for them to mention the earthly birth of Jesus if they wanted to, and it's caused problems for some people that they don't. In Mark 6, for example, the crowd asks, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And that would be an obvious place for someone speaking Jesus's part to say, well, actually, he's the Son of God. Actually, he's not Joseph's son, as you might think he is, but he has a divine origin, and he was born in Bethlehem. Likewise in John, Philip says to Nathaniel, we found him about whom Moses and the law and also the prophets write. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Q, you'd have thought, for saying, well, he's not out of Nazareth at all, actually. He's out of Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And he's not the son of Joseph, as is suggested in that passage. But no, there's no mention of it. Why? I think the only explanation can be that, again, agenda. God feels that he has given a sufficient, majestic account of Jesus's origins before time, and doesn't want to have a distraction from that story.
Well, Charles, I feel like we're just sort of scratching the surface of a massive topic. And in the next episode, we're going to go further into some of those differences in Matthew and Luke, differences in inverted commas, potentially, and look at some of the things around the virgin birth and things like that. But that's all we've got time for today. So thank you so much, Charles.
Very much enjoyed our conversation, Ruth. Look forward to continuing it.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable. For more shows, resources and our newsletter, visit premierunbelievable.com.